Almost 3 years after Gears of War 4, the Coalition has finally released their follow-up, simply titled Gears 5. But before we go any further, I need to stress that this will be a spoiler-filled review. So if you don't want anything to be spoiled, you really should skip this video now. Looking back at the Coalition's first attempt at bringing Gears back, many would agree while Gears 4 played very well from top to bottom, the new characters and world building wasn't nearly as strong as the previous mainline trilogy. Gears 5 looks to fix these mistakes, by changing things and mixing them up from who the central story follows, but also how the main story plays out. Let's start with everything good about Gears 5, and there's a lot to be happy about. From an overall quality perspective, Gears 5 delivers. The storytelling has been stepped up and has the most in-depth story and richest story in the franchise. The gameplay is still rock solid, and now with a dynamic 4K resolution and 60 frames per second for One X users, Gears 5 is hands down the best looking game in the franchise, but also the smoothest. If you have a One X and an HDR TV, this is a demo-worthy game to show off just how HDR and high resolution can make a difference. A lot of the positives for me also stem from the changes to the Gears formula. The first and fourth acts play much like the other Gears games with a linear sense of progression going from point to point killing the enemy. But the second and third acts are now an open world light or sandbox style game, which is a completely new thing for the series. Making a large radical change like this is a risky one, but I think the Coalition did a fantastic job of not pushing the boundaries too far with the new in Gears 5. It's enough of a change that it keeps things interesting, but the missions and how you progress isn't a radical change that feels jarring. Some could argue that the open world is kind of lifeless and not a lot going on, but that's not really its purpose. It serves as a way to make things feel fresh, and it succeeds in that goal. But I must stress, even with these new changes to the formula, this is still very much a Gears game, and it plays like one in all the right ways. The gunplay still feels solid, and each weapon has a very distinct personality. Picking up that Lancer still feels great. Moving around from cover to cover is still the most fluid experience you'll find in the third-person shooter genre. For whatever reason, other third-person shooters never quite match the quality of the cover system in Gears. It's one of those things where you always think that other games do it fine, but then you pick up a Gears game and you remember it's the best of the best when it comes to just moving around from cover to cover. And that's where Gears has always shined, in that it's fun to play. If you were a fan of the series, Gears 5 plays exactly how you want it to, and the new aspects are a welcome addition. But with that being said, I do have to get into a few issues with Gears 5 in the gameplay department. My biggest criticism is the lack of interesting new enemies. For the most part, there isn't a radical new set of enemies for you to fight, and some of the new enemies are just plain not fun to fight. The first thing that comes to mind is the rejects and the flock. The rejects are DBs taken over by the swarm in some way, creating a DB that simply just runs straight at you. Kinda similar to the Sire from Gears 2, but a lot slower and a lot dumber. They aren't particularly that challenging and pretty mindless to fight. The same goes with the flock, which is a group of swarm leeches that swoop around and attempt to kill you by flying right into you. Again, like the rejects, there isn't a good strategy for fighting a flock because all you have to do is dodge the lunge attack and pump bullets into them for way too long. And eventually it will fall, presenting no real challenge. The enemy variety is something I praised Epic's Gears games for, and it's the one area that I feel like the Coalition games need to step it up a little bit. Interesting enemies is what makes any shooter fun and interesting to play, and while they have good enemies, the ratio of good to bad is a little too close for comfort. The campaign is still filled with way more instances of good than bad in this regard. But whenever a flock would hit the screen, I wasn't discouraged from playing, but I definitely wanted the fight to be over so I could move on. But let's move on to the other aspects of Gears 5, which is the story and how it's told. I have to commend the Coalition on this one, and I think Gears 5 shows that they can tell a story much better than Epic could. Not only that, but after Gears 4, a lot of people were worried, myself included, that the new characters introduced simply wouldn't be able to get out of the original cast shadow. Gears 5 does a much better job of blending in the older characters like Marcus and Baird into the story, giving Kate some much needed breathing room to tell her story. But the Coalition also finally ties up some loose ends that have been present for the franchise's entire run. Things happen in Gears 5 that call back to the original trilogy that finally shed some light to the questions that we never got answers for, such as why is the Locust Queen human and where did the Locust come from? What happened to Anya? These are questions many fans have expected answered for a long time, and while it shouldn't have taken to technically the 6th game in the franchise to get everything answered, we do finally have some answers. Whether or not you find those answers satisfying is going to be up to the individual player. While the answers to some of those questions were extremely sci-fi, I found them satisfying and interesting. Particularly the bit about Queen Mira being immune to emulsion and her DNA basically being coded so that way she could control the Locust due to that immunity, thus creating the line of DNA that lies in Kay and her mother, which also explains why they kidnapped Rada in the 4th game. Gears 5 really does tie a lot of things up in a good way, and I think it's very important that the Coalition did that, so that way it doesn't get out of control even more than it is. But the Coalition also set things up very nicely for the future, and for the first time in the series' history, I personally really want to see where the story goes in Gears 6. So before we get too much further, we have to talk about that scene. In the last act, a new Locust Queen is revealed to be Reyna, and she makes Kate choose between saving Del or JD. This choice is actually given to the player, and while this is a tough moment to talk about because while I think it's brilliant in some aspects, I struggle with trying to understand it in others. So again, let's start with the good. I have to admit that I did not see this moment coming, and it caught me completely off guard in a good way. The idea of making a decision with real repercussions is not something you expect when you play Gears. And while I have issues with the options given to the player, I think it was an extremely gutsy move to try and take the story in this direction that they are teasing. Not only was I surprised with the choice to begin with, but I was genuinely shocked when the Locust Queen killed the other hostage. I fully expected her to simply drag the other person away, but instead she straight up just snaps their neck and leaves their body to rot. Again, I want to commend the Coalition for taking some real risk in the story and providing the player with unexpected twists and turns. But before we go any further, I guess I should start by giving my choice of who I killed and why. I chose to kill JD, and I suspect most people will do the same. I say this because while JD does get some much needed backstory in Gears 5 that further reveals just what type of person he is, and as well as why him and Marcus don't have the best relationship, Gears 5 is 100% about Kate until this moment. The player never really has a chance to learn about who JD is other than on the surface. While on the contrary, I just spent the better half of 10 hours with Del learning about what secrets lurk in Kate's family tree. And while I still think Del is kind of a subpar version of Baird, I still have a bond with him that I did not have with JD. When it came time to make the decision of who to kill, the idea of saving JD had nothing to do with the fact that I cared about him. My mind instantly went to Marcus and the idea of having him to deal with yet another loss. And with the death of JD, Marcus and Kate now have a common goal and a reason to work together in taking down Reyna. But this also gives narrative reason for Marcus to be there and even be in the story, which when you compare it to Gears 4, that didn't have a strong narrative reason for him being there at all. With the inverse of this being where the player saves JD and hinting that JD now understands Marcus more and wanting revenge for his fallen ally. I just find the story of JD seeking revenge so much less interesting because of the lack of character development from Gears 4. But this is completely subjective and relies on how the story is going to be told in Gears 6. But that's also the beauty of the choice. Some players might not agree with me and can't bear the sight of seeing Marcus lose yet another member of his team and family. I'm super curious to know who people chose and why, so if you want to, please let me know in the comments of what your reasoning was for killing one person over the other. But let's get back to the narrative. The narrative diversion creates an opportunity that hasn't really existed in the Gears franchise, and I am super hopeful that the result is something that makes a real difference in how players experience Gears 6, and how the story plays out. Because if the Coalition doesn't take more risks and expand on the narrative they are creating, it will be a huge bummer. Overall, I really like the campaign in Gears 5. But to wrap this up, I wanted to do a short follow-up to my previous video which had me ranking the Gears campaigns in order from worst to best. If I had to put Gears 5 into that list, I think I would place it at number 3, slotting it as better than Gears 4 but not as good as Gears 2 and 3. While I think it does a lot of great things from a storytelling perspective and takes risks that are very cool and unexpected, the gameplay still doesn't quite get there in terms of enemy variety. After replaying all of the Gears games recently, I think enemy variety ended up being the single most important thing to the Gears formula, due to the way that every enemy encounter can play out a bit differently depending on what weapons the player is carrying and what enemy they are about to face. But the Coalition also gave an opportunity here to make something truly special with Gears 6. They have proven they can take risks in not only the gameplay side of things, like adding things like a sandbox-like environment, but also with the story, giving the player choice and deciding to focus on different methods of storytelling. If they can use some of that creative muscle to expand the enemy roster and give players something new and fun to fight, combined with that superb storytelling, you have the recipe for one hell of a Gears game. And with that, I will take my leave and say, as a Gears fan, I am extremely excited the way the franchise is going. Coalition might have had a rocky start with Gears of War 4, but Gears 5 has proven the franchise is in capable hands. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you thought of Gears 5 in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, it really helps us out. We'll see you next time.
She'll be back.
I know. But not if we find her first.